I'm building this chair out of 1x4s, and to be honest, I had no idea if anything was actually going to work, but I thought the best thing is starting with the base, because if I have a solid base, the rest might be easier. I don't know. So I cut out 4 pieces at 12.5 inches. This is going to be for the center post blocks. So I took these and I glued them all together on their faces, which ends up creating a 3 by 3.5 inch block. Later on, I'll be cutting this in half to create two 6-inch blocks, which are going to be separated by a dowel, and that's basically going to be the whole center post structure of the chair. Before the glue cures completely, I scraped off any excess to make cleanup easier. But moving on to the legs, while that dries, I cut out 6 pieces at 12 inches. And then on all of these, I cut a corner. And this is for just aesthetics, because these are going to be for the legs of the chair, and the corner is where it sticks out. I'm marking out a location for all the wheel holes because I'm using these casters with posts. So what I'm doing is just pre-punching the holes, and then I drill them out, and I'll just be gluing these casters in place. Moving on to the block, which should be cured now, I'm cutting it in half to two 6-inch pieces, and one of them I'm going to use later for the chair seat, but one of them has to be used for the base. I'll be turning this into a hexagon, so I set my table saw to 30 degrees, and I'm making all my cuts with the block face down, so it's going to be 3 inches tall, 3.5 inches wide. And what I'm doing is making 4 cuts just to the halfway point, and this will create the perfect hexagon. Here you can see how this is going to look. Basically, I'm taking all of these legs and attaching them to the hexagon post in the middle, all the way around. Now I'm mortising a 1/4 inch on all sides of the hexagon post. I went all the way through, which really wasn't necessary, but I don't know, it was kind of a neat look when I was done, I guess. But I grabbed the legs and I cut a 1/4 inch tongue on all of the legs. Or tenon. It could be one of those words. I'm not entirely sure right now. But then I glue the whole thing together, and as you see here, basically, like I explained before, these legs are attaching, but it's just a mortise and tenon joint. Once I had everything glued in place, I just plopped it on the table and used a mallet just to make sure everything was actually flush on the bottom, just to keep everything at a nice level surface. You probably also noticed the tape I put on here. That was just to try to help with glue cleanup as much as possible. And, well, it helped a little, but as you can see, there's clearly glue spill out. Once the glue was dry, I popped in the wheels and figured now was probably the best time to test out the strength before I went too far building out the rest of the chair. And it worked surprisingly well. Now for the center post, I'm drilling out a 1 1/4 inch hole because I'm using a 1 1/4 inch oak dowel. Last minute, I decided to add this bottom plate. I created another hexagon and then glued this in place. I then followed up with adding some dowels. I don't really know if this was necessary, and I thought it would look cool, and to be honest, I kind of hate it now. I don't really like how it ended up looking, but I think it may have added some strength anyway. But after that, I cut out the dowel. I cut it at 10 inches at first, which ended up being a little too high. I had to adjust that later to about 6 or 7. Next for the base was gluing the wheels in place. I'm using Titebond Quick and Thick instead of the usual Titebond 3, just because I didn't want this dripping out. And you really don't need a lot of strength just to hold the wheels in place here. And the last thing I had to do is add a whole lot of glue and then glue in place the 1 1/4 inch red oak dowel. And with that, the base is complete. So I moved on to the seat. I'm using the other 6-inch block here for seat support, so once again I'm drilling a 1 1/4 inch hole. This time though I'm leaving it as a square, not a hexagon. And I took some time just to check the seat height using this block as a reference here, just to figure out how much I had to drill out and then whether or not I had to cut down the dowel, which I did end up needing to do. Moving on to the seat, I'm starting with the seat frame. I'm starting off by cutting 4 pieces at 22 inches, which are going to be running lengthwise on the seat, sandwiched between another 2 pieces that I cut at 20 inches, which are going to be the width of the seat. I then cut a plywood panel for the cushion at 20 by 23.5 inches, which has to cover the entire frame. So for assembly, what I'm doing here is first attaching middle bracing. So 2 of the 22-inch pieces I'm gluing, nailing, and then screwing in to the center post. Next, I attach the front and back, just making sure that the middle dividers are lined up correctly so everything is going to be nice and square. And then after that, I can add the other 2 pieces and end up with a frame that looks like this. Now, before I actually make the cushion, I'm taking the plywood and I'm attaching some blocks just to make sure that I can actually plop this in place so it holds on the frame, doesn't slide off. And then I can cut the foam to the size of the plywood sheet. And then after that, I'm just gonna take some fabric, layer the foam, and then plywood, and then just staple everything together, which isn't necessarily the best way to do this, but it's easy, and I don't have a sewing machine, so this is what I end up doing. And I have a more in-depth video on this for making dinette seats for my camper. Unfortunately, I didn't have plywood scraps long enough to cover the full length, which is why this is 3/4 of an inch short, but it still worked perfectly fine, and this is functional as a stool right now. So moving on to the back, I'm cutting out 2 pieces at 3 feet, and then I'm cutting a 20-inch piece, and basically these are just going to create a U shape. So assembling these together, it's pretty simple. Just like everything else, I'm gluing, temporarily brad nailing, and then screwing together. But now what I'm doing is I'm cutting out 21.5-inch pieces for slats on the back, and I'm using my thin rip guide to rip out a bunch of 1/4-inch slats. And then with these slats, I'm just gluing and pin nailing them in place along the back. I thought this was a good idea at first. I thought it would make it breathable, but it actually sucks. It's really uncomfortable, so maybe if I rounded off the edges, it would be better. Before finishing the slats, I wanted to attach the back to the seat frame because later on the cushion would get in the way of finishing the slats. But another mistake I made here was making the back 90 degrees to the seat when it should have been 95, 100, or maybe even 105 degrees. But after that, I could install the cushion and finish all of the slats. Now the last thing I had to do is add the armrests, which is pretty simple. Again, I'm just attaching a couple pieces of wood together, and then after that, I'm making some extra tiny cushions in the same method, but just much smaller for the armrests. And then I'm just attaching those to those pieces I assembled and simply screwing those to the side of the chair. Now I don't even know if this was necessary, but I added this brace on the back just to add a little bit of extra strength on the back since I would be leaning against that. But after that, I was finally done with this prototype chair.